Good afternoon. It's terrific to be with you, and welcome to our Melbourne Conversations event, Getting to Zero. What does AIDS HIV response mean for you? My name is Lindy Burns. I'm a radio broadcaster on ABC local radio across Victoria and Tasmania, including 774 ABC Melbourne each weeknight between 7 and 10. And I've been working in the radio game since 1990, primarily hosting late afternoon current affairs programs in New South Wales and Victoria, which means, of course, that I've been talking about HIV and AIDS for the duration of my career. As a person who started broadcasting within the sporting arena, it understandably took NBA superstar Magic Johnson's announcement in November of 1991 that he was HIV positive to get me to sit up and take notice of this new epidemic. His announcement, of course, had come almost immediately after the death of Freddie Mercury. The world was starting to wonder what the hell was going on. How many more would we lose? At the time that AIDS came to public attention, though, it was portrayed as a disease of the drug injector and the homosexual. Still is for some people. A punishment from God for all of those who sought to live their lives in unacceptable ways. The first journalist to write about AIDS was Lawrence Mass, who wrote in the gay newspaper The New York Native in 1981 that rumours of a growing epidemic were unfounded. Isn't it interesting? That was May of 81. But then in July, the New York Times wrote of a rare cancer in 41 gay men in San Francisco and New York. The word and the accompanying fears were spreading as rapidly as the disease. In October of 1985, Rock Hudson dies. Just 3 months earlier, he had admitted to becoming the first American celebrity to say that he had AIDS. The fact that he died so quickly after the announcement and that he was an American hero, it starts to frighten people. You mean AIDS could affect me or my family or my schoolgirl crush? International attention on the disease exploded. In 1987, investigative journalist Randy Schultz publishes And the Band Played On: Politics, People and the AIDS Epidemic, ostensibly accusing the American medical and political systems of letting the spread of the disease become much worse than it needed to have done, primarily because of incompetence and apathy towards those who were being infected. Gay people. Schultz knew what he was talking about. He died himself of AIDS in 1994. Australia leads the way with AIDS education with a terrifying advertisement called The Grim Reaper in 1987. It provokes a generational change in sexual behaviour and protection. Hey, we were all at risk, not just junkies and puffs and whores, but we're in many ways ahead of the game in comparison to the rest of the world. But you know what? It also prompted fear and panic in Australia. What about all that unprotected sex that we had in the 60s and 70s? How long before that came back to haunt me? On December the 1st of 1988, the first World AIDS Day is held. Designed to bring awareness as well as education to a rattled yet ignorant world, its first theme was simply communication. Still, people kept dying. In the 90s, the world loses British actor Ian Charleson as well as Anthony Perkins and Peter Allan. Science fiction writer Isaac Asimov dies in 1992. It is later revealed that he died of AIDS as a result of a blood transfusion back in 1983. Kenny Everett dies. In a particularly heartbreaking story, the wife of TV star Paul Michael Glaser dies from AIDS-related complications after receiving a blood transfusion 10 years earlier during childbirth. Her son and daughter also contract AIDS, her daughter Ariel dying in 1988. In 1993, novelist Bryce Courtenay publishes April Fool's Day, the story attributed to his son Damon, a haemophiliac who contracted HIV/AIDS through an infected blood transfusion. In 2000, the World Health Organization estimates between 15 and 20% of the new HIV infections worldwide are the result of blood transfusions, where the donors were not screened or inadequately screened for HIV. The focus is shifting. Oh my God, there are people contracting AIDS who deserve our sympathy and treatment. It's not just about drug taking and sex. Governments start to react with legislation and money for drug treatment and research. It's taken too long, but at last a realistic global movement is starting. But the focus also shifts to third world countries in Africa and Asia, where education is minimal and access to appropriate health and medicines such as antiretroviral drugs is limited. Women and babies suffer the most. But the disease also targets the fittest and the strongest in those communities, leaving the frail and the children to fend for themselves. In 2005 alone, the 1.8 million people who die from AIDS, 1.3 million of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. 2005 also sees a shift in the focus themes attached to World AIDS Day. It begins to reach further, to become proactive. Its 2005 theme is simple: stop AIDS, keep the promise. It will be the same theme for the next 3 years. In 2009, it becomes universal access and human rights. And in 2011, a change to encompass the most powerful and challenging prospect, getting to zero. This will be the theme until at least 2015, or I guess as long as it takes. Getting to zero. Zero new HIV infections. Zero discrimination. Zero AIDS-related deaths. To round it out for you, the current UNAIDS strategy is this: to achieve universal access to HIV prevention, treatment, care and support, to halt and reverse the spread of HIV, and to contribute to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals for 2015. Does it sound impossible? Perhaps it is, because we haven't stopped AIDS. We're not even remotely close. More than 7,000 people are newly infected with HIV every day. And even though we have moved so very far from those early terrifying, myopic, discriminatory years, a revolution in prevention politics and policies and practices is critically needed. The will is there, politically, medically, humanitarianly, from the famous and the unknown. The logistics are formidable, but at least there is a workable plan. You probably know that next year in July, Melbourne will host the International AIDS Conference. It's the largest medical conference to ever be held in Australia. With that in mind, and on the eve of World AIDS Day 2012, it is timely that we look at where we are in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Ask questions like, can current treatments actually halt the progress of the disease? Are they that powerful? And is the fact that people are still dying simply a matter of access to them? Who is it that is still at risk? Where do they live? What do they know about HIV? Are the right people being targeted? How do we remove corruption and political power from the equation? Change cultural mores that we barely understand? And what of Australia? What is our role, both within our own borders and beyond? Are there new treatments being developed? Is there still a stigma attached to an HIV diagnosis? And if so, why? And how do we change that? And most importantly, is that stigma preventing people from acknowledging their disease and receiving treatment? HIV prevention and treatment is a multifaceted task. Not only are the logistics almost incomprehensible, but we are talking about a multidimensional issue: medicinal, cultural, geopolitical, financial, transgenerational, sexual, psychological. But the reality is that this is still one of the most dangerous, potent pandemics that the world has ever faced. And the reality remains that those most vulnerable to it come from our most marginal communities in Australia and outside. But they are not the only ones. So to answer some of those questions today, and given that the only expertise that I have is in mountaineering and the music of the band Queen, we have 3 panellists of the highest order who all have a significant role to play in the implementation of the Getting to Zero strategy. I'm going to introduce them to you one at a time. They'll come up and address you, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So starting with Brent Allan. Brent is the CEO of Living Positive Victoria. He's been working in the community response to HIV/AIDS since the early 90s, both in Australia and abroad. He has qualifications in health education, business, community services management, as well as public and social health, and has worked at all levels of government in this fight. As a gay man living with HIV for the past 15 years, he has been active in efforts to build the capacity of people living with HIV through advocacy, education and representation, and has been the past Vice President of the National Association of People Living with HIV, also a convener of the International Think Tank on Gay Men's Health. Can you make Brent Allan welcome? Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy. I'm going to give you a little bit of a perspective of what zero means from someone living with HIV. And I want to sort of interrogate the 3 aspects of getting to zero that Lindy spoke about: 0 deaths, 0 new infections, and 0 discrimination. But I want to take us a little bit further into what I think are some of the other opportunities of zero for us in Australia. So in terms of 0 new infections, the issue, and just to elaborate on what Lindy was saying, in Australia there's a new infection every 4 days. There's 28,000 worldwide. They're rising in every state, including Victoria, and we're set to fail in terms of achieving the targets of 50% reductions as long as we're continuing down on this train. Certainly, I think the response is combination prevention, about good leadership, solid leadership that's based on partnership, scaling up testing, treatment, and prevention, and of course, community mobilization. If we talk about 0 deaths from HIV, I think the issues here are self-evident in terms of the numbers. And including, I wanted to put in the 32 deaths in Victoria in 2010. These are people who had HIV, didn't necessarily die from AIDS, but we don't actually know if their HIV status contributed to their deaths. And in terms of a response to this, I think something that's really important is we need to understand why they died. And I think there should be a forensic examination into why people are dying, including if it's from HIV or if it's about associated comorbidities and mortalities. In terms of 0 discrimination and stigma, discrimination and stigma in particular, which is what I'm quite passionate about, it does affect treatment and uptake as well as testing rates, disclosure, depression, anxiety, the individual's health, and as well as community well-being. Unacceptable high levels of stigma and discrimination continue to exist in Australia and worldwide. And the sense of felt stigma, that stigma that you hold inside yourself so that you censor yourself from testing, or you censor yourself from taking treatment, or you censor yourself from telling your family and friends, emanates from people's personal experience and fear. And that's an important thing we have to disable. Certainly the response, public campaigns to call out stigma, referral to authorities where discrimination occurs. And we know of cases where people have been discriminated against, believe they've been discriminated against, but don't go, for example, to their employer. Do not go and tell the authorities that this has happened to them and it's unlawful because they're afraid for people to know that they're HIV positive. And building the resilience of people living with HIV is important. These next 4 are about what I think are important things and not necessarily in the UN Declaration. In terms of inappropriate prosecutions, the use of criminalization of people and the use of the criminal court system to prosecute people living with HIV makes them feel not only like a criminal, but further contributes to stigma and shame. It also drives down testing rates, willingness to disclose. I do not believe that it's a good way to be dealing. And in fact, I would much rather advocate and much rather see referral to public health as a mediator for people who may not understand their obligations around disclosure, but also building the disclosure skills of people with HIV. Just because you acquire HIV does not mean you acquire the skills to disclose effectively and in a proactive and empowered way. I mean, those skills need to be built and we need to invest in that. In terms of late diagnoses, there are increasing rates of late diagnoses. These have significant effects upon the public health as well as an individual's health. Individuals who present late with HIV because they didn't know they had HIV have diminished treatment efficacy. They're more likely to contribute to the rising rates of infection because they don't know they're HIV positive. And they have more damage done to their immune system. They also have greater side effect profiles when they start taking the drugs because their immune system is already in a compromised state. In terms of the response, definitely increase the volume of testing, increase the technologies available, including at-home and rapid testing. We need to normalize testing for positive people and everyone. It should be something that we just, especially high-risk populations, it's something you just do and you should be doing on a regular basis, depending on what sort of risks you have. And again, understanding why. Why are people presenting late? Is it because they're from a marginalized community? Culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds, women who often present late because they don't feel they're at any risk. 0 treatment barriers. We have great access to treatment in Australia, I'm not going to deny that, but there are still access barriers and I think we have to remove those if we're going to get as many people on treatments to drive down new infections. The cost of treatments can be prohibitive for some people. You know, if you're on a 3-drug regimen, that could be $90 a month. For some people, that's a serious amount of money. That, you know, and they may, for example, take an inappropriate treatment holiday because they can't afford to buy their drugs for that period of month. Archaic dispensing mechanisms. I don't understand why we can't mail order drugs. You know, if you live in the bush somewhere, why do you have to travel an hour and a half to get to a pharmacy or longer? The inflexible and inconsistent prescribing criterion practices. This is about people not being able to get the drugs when they want the drugs because they haven't hit the magic number in terms of their low their low CD4 count. I believe that if a positive person is ready to take drugs, they should get on the drugs. In terms of access and barriers, poor treatment adherence, and delayed uptake of treatment, we need to really focus on changing the way we get drugs into people's hands, including in Australia. Increasing co-management systems, and encourage patients and clinicians to get more people on treatment. In our organization, our line is not about, whether you do or do not get on treatments. You will go on treatments, unless you want to die. Our job, we believe, as a peer-based organization, is to help people understand when is the right time for you to go on treatment so you're most successful. That's our challenge. In terms of social isolation, again, this is a really passionate one for me. In terms of what happens out there for people living with HIV, lack of contact, living below the poverty line. 50% of women living with HIV live below the poverty line. And they're more likely to report depression and anxiety. I think we do need to do more work around creating safe places for PLW HIVs. We have to provide better support, more support in different mechanisms, and we really do need to stop the stigma, which I believe is one of the chief reasons why this epidemic still continues to grow and expand around the globe. And that's our campaign. If you're interested to see how to stop stigma or participate in it, please go to that website and have a look. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Brent. You'll get a chance to ask Brent some questions toward the end of the presentations. Can I introduce you now to Associate Professor David Anderson, who has spent the last 25 years at the Burnet Institute here in Melbourne, focusing on diseases of poverty and disadvantage around the world, of course, including HIV and AIDS. David, thank you.
Thanks, Lindy. I see many familiar faces here, and I think all of you will be happy that the scientist on the panel decided to dispense with slides today, because I know that way madness and boredom often lie. But in my 10 minutes, I really wanted to reflect on what has for me been a career lifetime of working in an environment where a very large focus of the Burnet throughout that time has been on HIV/AIDS, both in Australia but increasingly overseas. I started at Fairfield Hospital in 1982, and very soon afterwards we started seeing the first HIV patients. But in those days, they weren't HIV patients, they were AIDS patients. You didn't need anything to test someone to see who was sick, because it really was very, very scary. And I remember very clearly what it was like when patients started being able to go on to AZT treatment, and suddenly they would be well again. And that was such a fantastic outcome. And as Lindy and Brent mentioned, Australia has really led the world in many of our education and social responses and getting people onto treatment, attempting to address stigma, very effective needle and syringe exchange programs that really, if a few other countries like the US had followed our lead, the epidemic in the West at least would be much less severe than it is now. But of course, and in terms of what getting to zero means to me, it really comes down to, for me and for many of us at our institute, addressing the inequity between the very effective responses we've had, particularly in Australia, but to a lesser extent in many other Western countries, and how far behind we are in addressing the same problems, many of the same problems, in developing countries. There are about 35 million people infected with HIV in the world. 30 million of them are in developing countries where most of them don't have access to regular medical care. Most of them don't have access to the CD4 testing that would allow them to go onto drugs. Only around half of them know that they're infected with HIV, possibly a similar situation to the US and to a lesser degree here. How do we address that when there are hundreds of millions of people at risk, tens of millions of people infected who don't know about it, and the responses that work in Australia that have been effective here aren't necessarily going to work there? We need new approaches, new technologies. But I really see Australia's role here in two ways. The first is to lead by example. We're a resource-rich country. If we cannot afford to spend the resources to end discrimination, make drugs available to everyone who wants them, go to the effort of making point-of-care testing available like it is. Anyone in Africa can get a point-of-care test for HIV, but no one here can. If we can't put the effort and the expense in to do those things properly, then we can't expect the rest of the world to really lift their game. And for as badly as America has responded to its own epidemic, and as much as I dislike giving too much credit to George W. Bush for anything, PEPFAR is really the biggest contribution that I think has been made to the international response to HIV. And we want to encourage other countries to step up to the plate. It's been encouraging that AusAid is certain, and our federal government has certainly increased its commitment over the next period to increased aid to many of the countries that are suffering most from the epidemic. So we need to show leadership in that area. But I think we also have a very strong leadership role to play in the technical and practical on-the-ground effort in many of the countries that are suffering the most from the HIV epidemic. In the technical areas and in the area that I work in myself, creating better tools that will work in those settings where they don't have access to the laboratories that we need to do HIV testing, or more importantly, in terms of being a block to getting onto treatment, testing of how much damage has been done to your CD4 T cells. And normally at this point I would pull one of our CD4 point-of-care tests that looks just like a pregnancy test out of my pocket. This is the only suit that didn't have one in the pocket, so I apologise. But Brent knows what they look like. That sort of technology is going to make a difference because it will mean that people can be tested, they can get the result at the same time. And one of the areas where that lack is most sorely felt at the moment is in preventing infection from mother to baby. Now, we are very fortunate that the virus does not cross the placenta to any significant degree. Babies are exposed to the virus during birth, and if the mother is given even a very short course, even at the time of delivery, of very strong antiviral drugs, you can reduce, and continuing through to the end of breastfeeding, you can reduce the chance of transmission to effectively zero. And there is no better outcome than stopping infection of the baby, because once that baby is infected, with the best drugs in the world, they are not going to live a full and healthy life, because we don't have the drugs to keep someone alive and healthy from that age. But currently in many African countries, if about 50% of women are first diagnosed during their one and only visit to an antenatal clinic. So they come along to an antenatal visit, they get tested with an on-the-spot test, they find out they're HIV positive. That will come as a bit of a shock, of course. But then blood is taken for them to get a CD4 test, because you need to know their CD4 count to decide which of two equally effective methods you'll use to prevent infection of their baby. Either you give the mother something just to prevent transmission, or you put them on lifelong treatment for their own health and to protect the baby. But in a resource-poor country, you actually can't afford to put every woman who's infected onto therapy. They're not going to stay on therapy if they're healthy, and it just causes problems down the track. 40% of women never get the result back from their CD4 test, and so they don't go on to either of those therapies. And so we have 1.5 million pregnant HIV-infected women in the world each year. Half of them, roughly half of them, are giving birth without having had access to those very simple and very effective methods to prevent transmission to their baby. There are roughly 400 HIV-infected babies born each year in Papua New Guinea. No, it's just shameful. And this is the kind of thing that really gets us working, I suppose, very hard on trying to find and deliver solutions that can change that. But I really want to emphasise that it does take that coordinated approach, I think, and we can't be banging on about how we can more effectively address the epidemic in developing countries unless we are doing a good job at home. And that job at home is a very different job. Many of the problems here are different to the ones that we're facing. I hope we will eventually get to the stage where in Nigeria they have the sort of problems that we're now facing of the comorbidities, the heart disease, the lipodystrophy that you get from being on some of the drugs for long periods of time. At the moment, their biggest problem is just staying alive and not infecting other people. We will get there, but it will take that coordinated approach, and we have to keep pressure on our governments at all levels to keep up the effort both locally and overseas through both our foreign aid, and I'll unashamedly put in a plug for medical research, because we just can't afford to let the ball slip there. Australia has made and will continue to make very strong contributions on both the public health and the education and the technical sort of innovation side for HIV. And I think that we can't afford to let that slip. And I think the other thing that Australia has been a terrific leader in is how well the different arms of our community addressing HIV have worked together. I found it very striking in the Washington AIDS meeting which was in it was an enormous conference in a not particularly well-designed convention centre, but you could kind of tell which part of the conference you were in by just looking around at the crowd and seeing, were they in suits? Were they in African national dress? Were they holding placards, etc.? I kind of think we'll see something different here, because everyone here is working together. And that's something I really look forward to when we get to host the meeting in 2014, is to really show the world that Australia is committed to this cause of zero new infections. We're doing our bit, and help get other people to pull their weight as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. To Dr. Leslie Cannold now, author, commentator, activist. She's an award-winning columnist, oft noted as one of Australia's leading public thinkers. She has in fact been listed alongside Professor Peter Singer, Professor Gustav Nossel and Inga Clendinnen as one of Australia's top 20 public intellectuals, and recently made the Power Index's top 10 list of most influential brains. Capable of making sense of some of the most difficult issues, she's often a fresh voice in a situation that seems intractable or deeply confusing. Let's see what she makes of this. Leslie Cannold, good afternoon to you.
Well, in fact, I was extremely happy to be asked to speak here today, but I definitely felt, and I now continue to feel, having seen the presentations, that I am the least expert of the experts here. So I thought what I would do is take up the part of the question that asked what the epidemic means to me, and to try to ask the question, now that we are, at the end of the third decade of the epidemic and the start of the fourth, whether or not, while we're not at the end of the beginning, we might be, we might be at the end of the beginning rather than the beginning of the end, to ask that question. And if we are, what does that say about our aspirations for the progress of things in the region? So my reminiscence starts with the first time I really heard about what was then AIDS, because as David has rightly said, when people were presenting initially, they had AIDS, and there just wasn't the knowledge about HIV and testing. I grew up in New York, so some of the early cases were actually being identified as something called GRID at the time, which was gay-related immune deficiency. And initially there were all kinds of ideas about what it might be. I remember really clearly where I was when I realised that this issue that was being covered in the New York Post in quite a sensational way was actually something that I needed to pay attention to. I was at university, and I must have been, so the images of me walking back to my dorm, so I must have just come from some sort of an information session. And I say information because really not a lot was known. So essentially what was delivered to us as university students was that there's this really scary disease out there. It will kill you if you get it. We don't know exactly how you get it, but we think it's sex. We don't know exactly how you ought to prevent it. a condom might help, but then again, it might not. We don't know if it's just actual intercourse or oral sex or kissing even that might give you it, so be careful. I was 19 at the time. So what I remember feeling, and I think that's why I remember the moment, was that without realising I had been promised this birthright of a new era. My mother was a feminist, and I was being promised an era where I could actually have sex and not feel bad that I wanted to have sex, enjoy sex, and I didn't have to pay the consequences for any of those things by getting pregnant. If I did, I should, use contraception, and if I had an unwanted pregnancy, I should have an abortion. All of those ideas that were about to kind of be enacted in my life, I was about to go forth and have sex. At that very moment, I was being told, don't do that, could be very, very dangerous. And subsequently, of course, I learned that a very similar sort of sense of being robbed of something that you'd never actually even fully experienced was also being experienced in the gay community, that had similarly fought very hard, just as women had fought, to be allowed to talk about and have sex without all the stigma and all the kind of negative ideas about it, and that idea had been, that sort of promise had been quickly taken away by this disease that people still didn't understand. As it happened, it was really more a sort of mental rip-off than a physical rip-off because, as I said, I was 19 and I then proceeded to go about doing lots of stupid things and not really looking after myself properly. And I was, I think, in retrospect, lucky, maybe not so lucky, I don't know really what my risk was. Again, nobody could quantify anything back then, how at risk one might be. I didn't end up getting pregnant, I didn't end up getting HIV, I didn't end up getting a whole bunch of STIs. Back then everyone was worried about herpes as well, and so I lucked out, really. So skip forward and I ended up in Australia. I was actually just backpacking through Australia, if anybody's interested, and just, it was a trip I was going to take through Southeast Asia and starting in Australia, and here I am still haven't got to Southeast Asia. Must make that trip. And I went to university, and then I got one of my first jobs, which was at the National Centre for HIV Social Research, which was a newly minted centre that was trying to look at the social and emotional and psychological ramifications of people being diagnosed with what was then, HIV, and the idea of trying to live with HIV, and the idea of what was still then considered in the early 90s a death sentence. And so still the idea was we were doing research where we were asking people to try to reflect on the impact of getting a diagnosis and what it meant. And in particular, I was looking at men's desires for intimacy. So I wrote a paper, and you can tell right here that I really hadn't had any contact with the media world yet because of the title of this paper, which I cringe at now, but here it is. HIV as a catalyst for positive men's desires for clarification, enhancement, and promotion of intimacy in significant relationships. Can you believe I wrote that? But I did, and I published it. And I remember really clearly the man who, I interviewed many men for this paper and, did the thing about interviewing people not really knowing so much what you're looking for as social researchers do. And then sort of, these issues rising to the top, which were about these desires that men had to pursue intimacy in the face of death, imminent, an early death, and in the face of this stigmatized condition that they had, that they felt they needed to grapple with issues around disclosure and all of those things. And I remember really clearly sitting in the living room with a beautiful young man who was my age and who was facing these enormous questions that were not live in my own life, but just being struck by what it would be like to be in your mid-20s and looking down the barrel of a foreshortened life and wanting very much all of a sudden realising that you wanted to fast forward the bit where you just had casual sex because that no longer seemed possible anyway, but wanted to get to the intimacy bit, and then how did you tackle all of the issues around being intimate with someone when you had the condition. It was just enormous, and it was such a, enlightening conversation. He was so generous with his time and with his inner struggles, and he was an amazingly insightful young man. I also at that time was being managed by a wonderful man who doesn't seem to be here. I wish he was, so I could tell him to his face how wonderful he was, named Bill O'Loughlin, who was my boss and was the kind of guy who cringed every time he'd get called a boss because he hated being called a boss. He was such a wonderful manager, and he taught me things, and that whole experience taught me things that continue to shape my perspective to this day. So he taught me things, for instance, about the issues that around being gay and that being such a stigmatized thing within the Catholic faith, and he was Catholic, and how that would drive people perhaps into, for instance, trying to be priests, which was something he had tried to be, as a way of managing that issue. So all sorts of insights about sexuality and stigma that to this day have really influenced me, and in fact my organisation at the moment, Reproductive Choice Australia, is doing a stigma campaign, and I realised recently that I'd called on a lot of the ideas that Bill had taught me all the way back then. And there was also the ideas about action research. So the gay community was so far ahead of everyone else in terms of thinking about trying to organise research, not in an abstract way and not just to let researchers kind of toddle off and do what we thought was a good idea to do and then just hope it was useful somehow and that someone would get to it in some archaic journal, but rather to be sitting at the table with people who actually had the condition, to ask them what they wanted to know, what would have been meaningful for them for us to go and find out about, then to actually design research interactively with them, to go out and do the research, and then to have formal processes by which we fed that result back to them. And years later, as I would sit in other organisations where everybody would have a eureka moment that this was a good idea, I realised how blessed I'd been to be involved from a very early stage in this sort of thinking about how research ought to be done. And also there were issues, you know, at that time, even then, which again still inform me about Big Pharma, but I'm running out of time, so I'll skip forward a bit. I was also supporting somebody at that time named Adrian, who I really want to pay some homage to. So I was doing peer support, and that was a really amazing experience for me and an important one. Adrian was a young man who was infected with HIV and then got AIDS, and he was around for the birth of my first son, who he babysat. So here we are now, at this point, my reflections. I don't know what happened to that young man who told me about his struggles with intimacy. You know, research gets de-identified. I couldn't find that information even if I wanted to now, but I often wondered what's happened to him. Bill O'Loughlin's still around and doing wonderful work, and Adrian is dead. He's been dead 16 years, and the last thing I remember about him was my bringing my second child into the hospital where he was dying, and he couldn't babysit anymore. He was way too sick. He took the baby, and it was so important for him to be able to have had that experience of babysitting and to be able to take the baby, to be in a world and around people who knew that that was all fine and good and okay and completely normal. He told me that I made great looking babies and that I should keep up the good work. We thought it would be a really good idea, as people in their 20s do, to take him in a wheelchair and run him up and down the hallways of the Alfred, because he was actually bored. Being really sick in a hospital is actually quite boring. So we did that for a while and caused quite a ruckus and then had to stop. And then somehow I ended up giving his eulogy because his parents were such unprepossessing people. They thought that I would be the best person to do it because I was an educated person rather than somebody who actually knew him a lot better than I ever had the chance to. So there you have it, sort of from, you know, a kind of victim sort of mentality, kind of somebody who'd been struck by this unknown condition. What was it? What were we to do? You know, does this affect me? Oh my God, it does. What should I do? Then you get to, you know, a sort of period of activism where people are actively campaigning to try to get across this issue, to try to get the research they need, to try to get the drugs they need. And now we seem to be at a stage, and this was not part of my own personal journey, but we seem to be at a stage where you could argue we're bureaucrats managing a chronic condition in the face of sometimes adverse market forces. So in the Western world, is that where we are? Is that an accurate depiction? I'm not quite sure. And does that, if it is an accurate depiction, mean that we're at the end of the beginning? And if it does, I guess the question I'd like to ask, and you all are probably far more expert in answering it than I am, is whether if that is our trajectory, whether that's the trajectory that we want to see followed in the region. So thanks very much for your attention.
I told you it was multidimensional. 3 very different experiences, personal experiences of what is a multifaceted issue and disease. I'm going to invite our 3 speakers to come and sit in a Tony Jones Q&A-like way in these chairs at the front here. We've got a couple of microphones that we'll share around. I'll ask a couple of questions, but I'm conscious of we don't want to run out of time as well, so I'm going to bring you guys in on the conversation. If you would like to ask a question of any of the speakers, please put your hand in the air and we'll get things going. So I'll just pop over. Yeah, the broadcaster never wants to have the microphone out of her hand, that's for sure. Guys, I've got some questions that I want to go to, but we've got a hand up already down here.
Hi, my name's Jim. I'm an HIV has-been, really. I've been around the epidemic since the early days in various capacities, either working in the community sector or working in government. And I want to actually address a question that hasn't been raised by anybody, though Leslie came close to it a couple of times, and that's the big myths that are the hard questions that nobody wants to ask. And they're always the ones that whenever in any of the jobs that I've had, when I've tried to ask, they've always created the biggest howls of concern and carry on. And the first big myth is, oh, we've done so fantastically well in Australia. Aren't we wonderful? We're so much better than everybody else. You know, we need a good kick up the arse if we really do think that. We haven't done a bad job, but we could have done much, much better. And we still go on with this myth, which is perpetrated by people like me who were in government, to say, oh, the government led this wonderful response. I mean, I remember as a community activist when I was on the first national HIV evaluation, the task force of the first evaluation for the first strategy, where I refused to sign the report because the Commonwealth government wanted to say we led the wonderfully successful response to HIV, and I kept saying you did not. The community led the response. You came in like 2 years later and put some money into it, but it was already being done, and that's gone on and on and on ever since. But there are all sorts of other myths as well. You know, the other big myth I think is that clinicians are the be-all and end-all. I'm sorry about this, David, but, you know... And, you know, when in Victoria, when I was the Director of Public Health here, I set up the thing called the HIV Prevention Task Force and copped a huge amount of flack from the clinicians because there wasn't a clinician on the task force for prevention. And I have to say, given a whole public health focus, which I had because I had a whole lot of other public health issues to deal with at the time, I don't believe that clinicians actually know very much about prevention at all. And they continually prove it in the way that they actually treat. You've raised a couple of really major issues there. I think we'll get a couple of comments on that, Jim. Thank you very much for your contribution. Brent, do you want to start in reaction? What was your...
Yeah. I having come from a country where there was a much more delayed response, being Canada, than Australia, I think that was a part of the problem in the beginning years. There was a bit of a head in the sand box kind of thing. Oh, it's not really that bad. Oh, it's just sort of those icky people who get it. So that's not really worry about them. I think what has typified the difference here in Australia, though, is the partnership approach. I will agree with Jim in the sense that does the partnership still exist in its robust way that it used to? But there was definitely that response in the beginning, and I think that made an enormous difference, and it's borne out by the epidemiology.
David, you've been in this area well, you were telling me before we started today that you're at the early days of the Fairfield Hospital when people were being treated, basically who were coming in diagnosed with AIDS. You were sort of almost at the beginning when the movement started in Australia to see, well, what the hell do we do about this? Did we do it well, or could we have done it better?
Well, I'm not about to say we couldn't have done it better. I think we did very well, and I think perhaps the thing we did best was we learnt from our mistakes fairly quickly, but we made mistakes that we had the chance to learn from. But I essentially agree with everything Jim said. particularly in terms of, medicine doesn't have all the answers, science doesn't have all the answers, and the thing I think we have generally done pretty well in Australia is to recognise that it takes different skills to address those different aspects of the epidemic. And one of the most disheartening things I see is, my apologies to Leslie on behalf of her countrymen, I suppose, is American scientists getting up at international AIDS conferences and saying, we've got the solution, we'll just treat everybody in Africa and there'll be no more HIV transmission. Never mind that half the people don't know they're infected. Never mind we can't deliver drugs to the people who do know they're infected. That is the kind of thing that I think we have largely avoided in Australia. I hope I'm not completely wrong about that, but I think there has been a lot more genuine interplay between the different sectoral responses. But I agree, I think clinicians are good at treating, they're not so good at the other responses. Scientists, well, we're good at something, I suppose. I hope we are.
Something along the way, you're sort of making an addition. Down the back here, yes. There's a microphone.
My name is Michael. I'm kind of dealing with stigma as a systemic issue. I think it was a couple of you have mentioned that perhaps HIV is a kind of a lens which reveals the vulnerable in society. And sometimes I think our health responses are invested in keeping people broken and not healthy. I wonder what we need to do differently so we address that power differential between the bureaucrats managing and the market forces and actually having community mobilisation that is, we have a different conversation.
So the question is, how do we break down the power differentials?
Are we invested in keeping vulnerable communities vulnerable and dependent? What kind of conversation do we need to have so that isn't the case?
I feel like I don't really know, to be honest. I'm not really sure I know the answer to that. I mean, I know that stigma is very important, and one of the interesting conversations that Brent and I had before we began is that this issue of stigma seems to be rising to the surface more commonly. So I work mostly in the area of abortion rights in terms of my own activism, and we did this campaign around stigma, and we were using the Twitter hashtag. For those who know Twitter, it's sort of a way of aligning a conversation. So we were using the hashtag End the Stigma, and the other people who were on it were people who were mentally ill. And it turns out that it's, we already knew, and in terms of my own thinking around stigma, because I've done a TEDx talk on it, I actually again modelled off of what we knew from the gay community and its engagement with HIV, and just with the issues around homosexuality itself. The expertise is definitely, I think, in that area around how you manage stigma and how you manage shame and silence and ignorance and all the things that come from it. And I think it's interesting at the moment everyone's talking about it, but I don't feel like I've got any more light to shed on that.
I was just wondering, on the back of what you were saying, and indeed what you were saying too earlier, Brent, about the whole idea of what stigma actually is, and is there something within society, something quite unfortunate, that is hell-bent on keeping those who we kind of look down on a little in their place. Otherwise, if they start climbing up the ladder, good God, they could be at the same level as us or better than us. And then who would we frown on? Who would we feel better than? And I think there's an element of that, not just with the gay community, but with a variety of communities. And I don't think we've ever adequately addressed that for a long time.
No, that I would agree with. And in fact, one of the things I've been observing and worrying about is that I think one of the most extraordinary political events that's happened this year in particular is watching, and I know that it's been a long time coming, but watching the gay community take an issue that, if you looked at the polls, was seen to be incredibly peripheral and incredibly marginal to most Australians, which was this issue of gay marriage, and driving it into a central place on the agenda and making it about key issues that we all can understand and relate to, which is about discrimination and equality and fairness and extraordinary activism, just amazing stuff. And one of the things I've started to worry about as someone who works primarily in the area of women's activism is that if the gay community does such a good job and they get themselves out of the hot seat in terms of being the stigmatised minority, who's going to be left in the hot seat still? It looks like, you know, in terms of what happened in the US, that the racial issue, when it came head-to-head with Hillary Clinton and the gender issue, race seemed to be the less stigmatised thing. Americans seem to prefer a black man to a white woman. And will women, if we don't start to organise ourselves and start talking about these issues, will we be the ones left? Because I suspect, as you do, that somebody's got to be there. There's always got to be somebody.
Look, I agree. I think there's this almost notion of othering that happens. And in terms of response to the question, that Michael's question, I think attacking stigma is incredibly important, understanding that we're looking for generational change. This does not happen with a quick campaign or multiple campaigns, where a generation needs to tick over before we're going to see a real change here. But in the meantime, our obligation is to build resilience. You know, I can tell the community to be nice to everyone, but where the real difference resides is when I help someone, an individual who's struggled around being stigmatized, to build their personal resilience and sense of agency and self, so that they can say, you know what, that's your issue, not mine, and walk away from it and not feel disempowered and not feel othered. And I think that's the flip side of stigma. I think that's what needs to be funded in terms of work, is building resilience.
Well, yeah, I agree. Thank you. Whenever we have conversations, I'm involved in conversations like this, for some inexplicable reason, I immediately think of The Simpsons. And I think of Homer Simpson standing front and centre in one episode going, "I'm a white, middle-aged American man, what's the world ever done for me?" Which I think is one of my favourite lines in the entire world. And yeah, if he doesn't want to get in that hole, Leslie, he doesn't want to be there. He's quite happy. We're sitting exactly where he is. Well, one more text in a moment. I think I'm on radio. One more person in a moment. David, you talked about being leaders in Australia and how we need to be leaders in this country. Where does that leadership come from? Is that federal government? Is that government at any level? Is it academia? Is it in the media? Is it people like Leslie and Brent and you and me? I mean, is it Jim? Who is it? Where does it come from?
I think we have dragged our politicians along, but they've been willing to be dragged. I think it has come from the community, all those different communities who recognised a problem, shared in their determination to do something about it. And you know, I've sat in meetings of Leslie's National Centre for Social Research, and it's all completely over my head, and I'm sure that Leslie and her colleagues have sat in some of the National Centre for HIV Virology Research and felt the same. But we all appreciated that it needed that coordinated response. And I think that it was having very disparate people going to both state and federal governments that made them think, you know, this isn't just a lobby group. And you know, someone like Michael Wooldridge, I think, was receptive. He you know, it was probably a good time to have a doctor as a health minister. He was receptive and he made resources available. But I don't know that we could exactly say that our politicians led. They no doubt took a lot of credit for leadership. I think the country has led, and the politicians have played their part.
My name's Louise, and my question is that how do we address what I see some complacency around prevention, if we want to get increased testing, at the same time as not driving further stigma and discrimination?
Who wants to take that?
The one thing I am aware of in terms of prevention, which I think is a really interesting just fact to, you know, funnel into the discussion, is that we need to be continually reminded about things in order for those sort of public health campaigns to work. So the TAC ads, as everyone will know, are incredibly effective. But once you take them off air, after a while, basically rates of whatever it is that they were going after go right back up. So there's no way, I think, of trying to raise awareness, whether through broadcast or narrowcast, without actually continually going at it. And until we get to zero and I don't know how realistic anybody really thinks that is. It will mean that we have to, whatever we do, we have to get it right in terms of the balance around stigma, but we have to keep doing it. And I think that question about how you can do it without raising these issues about stigma and shame probably go to this issue about broadcast and narrowcast and the language you use. But I'll turn it over to someone who's more expert.
I think complacency is a difficult word to use in terms, because it sounds like people are failing. And I'm not sure that people, well, I feel confident in saying, I think people with HIV know they're not failing. I think people with HIV take active regard in protecting themselves and protecting others in most cases, overwhelming number of cases. I think where some of the things that are falling down are around normalizing certain practices. And I'm not sure I would say normalizing condom use, but certainly normalizing testing. We have to normalize testing. It should be just commonplace that if, for example, you're a gay man, that you normally have tests, whatever that means, whatever normal may mean. We have to normalize it. By normalizing it, you also tackle the stigma. But complacency, I don't know a lot of complacent people about HIV. I know people who are confused, definitely. But I don't know a lot of complacent people.
I know we're running out of time, and in fact, my last question is going to go to you, Brent, as a person who actually is living with HIV. I think it's only appropriate that that's the case. And I'm just wondering, over those 15 years or thereabouts. Actually, I want to do one quick step back. What was your reaction when you were diagnosed?
So, I was not shocked when I was diagnosed with HIV, and I came to Australia as for work, didn't plan on staying, fell in love, and then contracted HIV, and was diagnosed with HIV. And I was lucky because I was diagnosed, and I went on treatment right away. I was in the era of the hit hard, hit early. So I went on treatment right away. I honestly believe it saved my life. Definitely saved my life. The one thing, so I was diagnosed in the era of treatment. Oh, I hate these personal questions. Why can't we talk about something esoteric? I think I was still very ashamed of acquiring HIV. I should have known better. I worked in HIV. I mean, I started working in HIV. When we talk about remembering it, I was in high school. I was I should have known better, and I felt ashamed, and that contributed to this sense of stigma. And I don't know why. Everyone says, "Oh, you shouldn't have been ashamed," but I did, and I think I felt that because it was wrong, and that it was wrong that I got HIV, and I did something wrong. And it's a very carnal, sort of visceral thing that happens inside you that makes you feel that you failed.
Add something which I think goes back to the question about not stigmatizing. There's a real parallel there with the way women feel when they fall pregnant when they don't want to be. So they also feel incredibly ashamed and embarrassed. And it seems to me that that's the flip side of us normalizing contraception. So if what we say to people is all children should be planned and you ought to contracept, there's going to be a stigma attached when you don't contracept and or contraception fails, and most people aren't aware of that. And it seems to me that, again, if you normalise condom use, it's very, very difficult then to not have some sort of flip side that suggests that if you get the virus, you must have done something wrong. And that's, just understanding it from pregnancy, that seems to be like this necessary corollary, and maybe part of where you go after trying to have a discourse around this is somehow trying to run some sort of narrow line between trying to say, this is what you ought to do, this is the normal practice, you ought to contracept, you ought to always wear a condom, but somehow if you don't, or alternately you do but you still end up getting the condition, you are not to be blamed or judged. And that's a really kind of narrow line through, and I'm wondering even if it can be done, but it seems to me like that must be the objective.
Let's hope so. I think that's probably a good point to leave it on this afternoon. Can you please thank our speakers today for being a part of, it's been a fascinating conversation.